Hi, Dr. Tatiana Stray here, and I want to chat a little bit about my favorite theory, which is attachment theory and how it applies in the workplace. Now, the reason why I think this is important because is a lot of the time we're thinking about attachments in the context of parent-child relationships and romantic relationships, but we stop there as if we stop being social creatures when we go to work. So I want to chat a little bit about the research in this space, and I just want to say it's like a new and growing uh, field, in part because I think we're starting to recognize that actually the way we have our relationships with our colleagues, bosses, and the people that we mentor is very much informed by the way that we have relationships outside of the workspace. So let's get into it. All right. So, attachment theory was something that was created early on to really understand how children formed relationships with their main parental figure. And what they found is that there are three main forms of attachment. Sometimes they call it four, but we're going to just simplify it for three because I think it's a lot easier to understand. One is securely attached individuals, and that's when you are comfortable with emotional intimacy. You understand the dance between interdependence and independence. You expect trust in relationships. You enjoy your relationships with others because there is that type of intimacy, and you are seen. And the important thing, actually, when they do studies on how these individuals process information, they equally process positive and negative information objectively, which means that when they're taking in information about the relationship, about the external world, they're able to be more objective about it. And you're going to see that this actually has a lot of consequences in the workplace. Individuals who have anxious attachment are people who need a lot of reassurance in their relationships, and they may struggle with the independent component of relationships. Generally, these are individuals where their parental figure was very inconsistent. So sometimes they were there, sometimes they weren't. And so the child kind of isn't sure what to expect of their figure. And so they're always engaging in these little reassuring behaviors to just confirm that the relationship is okay. And in the workplace, this also impacts in the way that we interact with our bosses to make sure that we feel stable in the relationship. The important thing is that when you look at how anxious attached individuals process information, they downplay positive information and they really focus on that negative information. So there is a hindrance on their ability to be objective because they're overblowing the negative information in their mind. And in the context of anxious attachment, it makes sense. Because they don't feel comfortable in relationships, they are actively seeking cues to let them know whether or not there's any trouble. So they have a guidance system focused on the negative stuff, and if positive information comes in, they discount it. And this is really important when we think about our relationships with our bosses and how we handle feedback. But it's important to understand that there is that bias in the mind. And avoidant attachment individuals are people that usually grew up with parents that were not there. And so they find it very challenging to have that interdependence with other people, in part because of the lack of emotional intimacy, the inability to be seen in relationships. They find relationships to be just a more hurtful place in general. And while they seek relationships, they don't often they still kind of struggle at that interdependence aspect, just because of the negative experiences that they had. And when you think about the way that they process information, generally they're a little bit less, they also have a bias, but they're actually less likely to engage in negative information, in part because it's so triggering. So there's a bit of a defense mechanism, and that negative information doesn't really sink in. There's a bit of a distancing there. So before I talk about how it impacts the workplace, I do want to just give you a little bit of a primer of how attachment theory impacts individuals. So it's formed early on in childhood. It is malleable and it's based on experience. And then the difficult part comes in that it also influences how we see the world. And so external information now becomes self-reinforcing. I think it's important to understand that it's malleable and that it can shift based on the stage of life we're at or the types of relationships that we're having. So I think even if you think back to certain types of bosses or relationships, romantic relationships that you had, there are some individuals that are not consistent in how they show up, and they activate those anxious, avoidant tendencies that you might have. Versus being in a space where someone is very consistent, honest, reliable, gives you solid information, makes you feel comfortable, it activates and it helps allow you to show up in a way that's more secure. So this is really important to understand, because I've seen a lot of, when I coach people through their careers, I often see that sometimes individuals will get a very bad boss and it'll shift their attachment in that space to be very anxious or distrusting. And they have a hard time dissociating those experiences and realizing that actually they became really anxious or avoidant because of that boss, not because of that's who they are in the workplace. But if you don't address those issues, they carry on with you in future jobs, and then you show up in a way that's a little bit more distrusting without your knowledge, right? So it's important to understand that it's malleable and it shifts and there's different domains. So even in a romantic relationship, you might be a little bit more securely attached, but in a workplace context, you might be a little bit more anxious. And that's, of course, also related to the type of boss you have. Attachment theory impacts the beliefs we have ourselves, whether or not we expect people to see us as worthy or if we kind of have self-doubt. It impacts what we expect of others. So securely attached people expect people to be trustworthy and to be responsive and to be reliable. And so the types of cues that they can show up in the workplace are a little bit different when they're starting to build relationships. But insecurely attached people often don't expect those things. And so the anxious people are trying to get some sort of semblance of security through these additional interactions, while avoidant people are trying to create some sort of distance so that they feel comfortable in that relationship. But if you notice, when we think about later about the ways that we form relationships, the avoidant ones definitely are harder to build trust with at work, because they don't want to show up. They don't want to talk to you. They want to get the work done and leave. So attachment also impacts expectations in relationships, where securely attached individuals expect close, fulfilling relationships, whether it's at work or at home. And securely attached styles may hinder those higher expectations for intimacy, trust, or dependency. It influences behavior, which is really important. Securely attached individuals are generally more responsive and expressive, while those with insecure attachments might exhibit avoidance or dependencies. And again, it continues and is generally somewhat fluid throughout life, although generally they are stable. And for you to change your attachment style, there needs to be some sort of therapy work or self-reflective work or learning about this for this to change, because very often when we get stuck in a pattern, we just kind of repeat it without realizing that we need something else, or that's not what we are. So let's chat a little bit about how attachment actually shows up at workplace. And there's different areas in terms of communication feedback, job commitment, the way we mentor, and one of my favorite research findings, which is how you handle toxic workplace environments. So definitely stay for that. All right. So when it comes to communication and feedback, securely attached individuals are definitely more open to communication and feedback. They're able to express themselves, they're able to give and receive feedback constructively, and they're not threatened by it, because they can objectively process those positive and negative aspects that are coming at them. And they can be really discerning in terms of, I'm going to work on this doesn't seem right, whatever, we're going to deal with this later, or this negative thing isn't that bad. That ability to process information objectively is really key in their ability to handle feedback constructively. Anxiously attached individuals, they need a lot of reassurance. And when it comes to feedback, they're hypersensitive to negative feedback. Because again, in their mind, it's not this negative thing that you delivered to them. It's that negative thing plus 2-3 times that they made it in their head. And so what they need is a lot of security and attachment. And It's interesting. I was once mentoring someone and they were saying that they have someone on their team that's just constantly asking for feedback. And he told his worker that they're doing a great job, keep going. But this individual kept asking for feedback, even when they were told they're doing a good job. So it's interesting. The manager's response to this was just saying, you know what, I'm just not going to respond to the emails. I'm going to try to like distance the emails and then they'll understand. And I sat there when I heard this story and I was like, do you realize you have an anxiously attached individual on your hands? And by you not responding, what you've done is you've reactivated the anxiousness. And now they're actually going to be messaging you even more because they think you're pulling away from them. So when you're handling, when you're giving feedback to an anxiously attached individual, you have to sit down and have a very good conversation about the feedback, but then also sometimes even talk about what does that negative feedback mean to them, and make sure that they're taking extra steps to not blow it out of proportion, and to have a really solid understanding that you're secure in the relationship, but you're delivering this for their benefit to develop further. So later this individual did start handling his coworker differently, or his employee differently, and there was a different response. But that's like a fascinating example how you can by mistakenly activate people's insecurities without realizing that's what you're doing, because you don't understand what's at play. Now, avoidant attachments definitely struggle to accept feedback and might not openly express themselves. So they'll downplay the importance of feedback, in part because it can be really intimidating to them. And there's this level of defensiveness in avoidant individuals where it's really hard for them to process. So one of the things to note is they do like space, they need space, and that's fine. You can give it to them, but you always want to make sure you come back and have a good discussion about what that means. And you don't want to be too imposing on the relationship, or the language you want to use may be a little bit different. It might be a little bit more you and I, versus with anxious, you might want to use the words we to refer to the relationship. But you want to make sure that they understand the importance of the feedback and respond to it. And I think with time, if you show yourself to be consistent, they'll definitely show up a bit more, because what they fear is that inconsistently and you not having their back in the relationship. When it comes to job commitment, securely attached individuals are definitely more likely to be committed to their jobs and organizations. They find emotional security in the relationship. They enjoy loyalty. They're motivated. Interestingly, because anxiously attached individuals are very relationally focused, you're actually going to see them exhibit higher forms of commitment than might actually be normal. But the problem is they don't find their job necessarily satisfying the way a securely attached individual might. They're actually going to have a lot of job-related anxiety and fear of abandoning, which impacts their satisfaction, but their loyalty is going to be very high. So one interesting way that anxious attachment will also show up at work is this tendency to jump over people's hoops. You have a commitment and a need to jump through people's hoops and to prove yourself and to keep going. And where a securely attached individual might be like, okay, we did this project, it was challenging, I'm satisfied, here we go. An anxiously attached person will do the project, not feel good enough, and then need to like keep jumping through their boss's hoops to prove their worth. There's no sense of stability in the relationship. And so from the outside, it might look like a very high achieving person, but underneath what's driving them is relational instability. So avoidantly attached individuals definitely are prioritizing independence and self-reliance over any form of job commitment. They might switch jobs, in part because they don't have strong emotional ties, or they might also stay in a job that they don't like because they don't necessarily think that there's anything better out there that's good for them. In terms of mentorship, securely attached people are like active in seeking mentors. They're also great at being mentors. Anxiously attached individuals definitely rely on mentors a lot for validation. They don't always make the best mentors, but they can because they're very focused on the relationship and giving. In part, they might overgive, but they're very attuned to the relationship. And avoidant individuals generally don't seek mentorship because they they are a bit avoidant, and this can be bad because in the workplace, relationships are very important in how we progress professionally. But when it comes to mentorships, they definitely aren't building people up. Like, they don't really have an interest in people's journeys. And they don't make great mentors from that perspective, because there is nothing emotionally satisfying to them for those types of relationships. Interesting, there are some research to say that when you have a securely attached person with an avoidant or an anxious, it makes the relationship better. That worker relationship is good, almost as good as two securely attached people. But once you have an avoidant and an anxious person together working, is very triggering for both of them. That is not good in terms of productivity, satisfaction, or developing. So that's just something to keep in mind, that maybe if something isn't working for you, it might also be your boss's attachment style that isn't working for you, or they're just not relationally attuned to that. And finally, some of my favorite research, leaving toxic work environments. So who is one of the first to leave? Fascinating. It's actually securely attached individuals, because they're more likely to see situations for what they are objectively, recognize it, acknowledge it, and then they have the self-esteem to go do something about it. They are the first people to leave a toxic work environment. Your talent is out the door, okay? Then, anxiously attached people find it very challenging to leave a toxic work environment, because underneath it, what's driving them is a fear of abandonment, and they're very used to tolerating toxic environments, unfortunately. And so I think it's important to be reflective about yourself too, that sometimes people stay in situations, and you have to ask yourself why, right? Are you staying there to prove something to someone? Are you staying there out of loyalty? Are you staying there because you're not processing the positives and the negatives objectively? Because if you are, there could be it could be an attachment style issue activated in that moment that's not allowing you to take the healthy step, which is sometimes to exit the relationship. And avoidantly attached people also struggle to leave toxic work environments because they are self-reliant. They're emotionally detached. They downplay the importance of relationship. And so they don't necessarily acknowledge the fact that these toxic environments impact them, and they might enjoy a different one. So I think when you think about what does this actually mean, I think it has a lot of implications for the way you as a leader mentor people below you, and your ability to give people what they need based on their core needs, rather than just blanketly using one type of feedback to everybody, because that doesn't necessarily work. I think if you're an employee, it's important to think about, what do you need out of a job? What do you need out of your boss? And maybe being a little bit more articulate about that. And if you know you have like anxious or avoidant attachment, it's important to understand your biases, so that when you do get feedback, when you are in a toxic work environment, you can think about the fact that, what do I actually want here? Am I processing the information to the best of my abilities? Should I be leaving? What would a securely attached person do? And it allows you to just have a little bit more room to move, and then get the help you need to kind of make the decisions that are most empowering for you. So I love this type of research. I think it's very impactful, and I think it looks at the workplace just a little bit differently. So I hope you guys found that helpful. And if you have any questions, drop them below, and I'll try my best to respond.